Well, welcome everyone. I'm Amy Simon Hopwood, Associate Curator of Decorative Arts. And as you can see on the screen, we have Luke Haynes here. We're waiting for people to come in. So I'll just kind of go over the general format and we'll give a couple minutes for people to arrive. But anyway, welcome to the Newark Museum of Art virtually. And if you're the first time visitor, or if you've been to some of our virtual tours before and our virtual presentations, we're very excited to see you again virtually. But it's nice to think of all of you out there. And we're just so excited to be able to present works from our collections in the Newark Museum of Art, and also as today, artists who are speaking about their work. And in our case, we're very fortunate to have a work by Luke Haynes in our collection. I'll say this again later, but first we'll have a presentation and then we will have a Q&A session. So for those of you on Zoom, you can ask your questions below under Q&A. And for those of you on Facebook Live, please add your questions in the comments field. And we can't guarantee that we'll answer everything, but we will try to get to as many questions as possible. But really, we're very excited about your participation. So it looks like we have a few more people, so we'll just give everyone a minute to settle in, see how many of your pets and children are wandering through. So it's nice to think of everyone out there. And we'll see if my cat puts in an appearance. He seems to know when we're running live.
Mine does as well.
Yes, so more creatures to appreciate art. So let's see, we'll just give it one more minute. I know it's that expectant pause, but there are a few more people logging in. We have a couple people saying hello. So you have my predecessor, who I'll mention in a moment, Ulysses Grant Dietz, is saying hello, and a special hello to Luke. And I did want to say that Ulysses was here for many years, really developed the collections. I've only been here for 2 years following in his ample footsteps. And he did, Ulysses was responsible for getting to know Luke and bringing in a quilt that Luke will be talking about into the collection. And I have someone else. We do have, it's on our website. We had planned to open in March 4 quilt makers, 4 American stories. So 4 quilts from our collection, one of which included Luke Haynes. And we unfortunately don't have an opening date and an end date for that, but as soon as we know what the powers that be say about our reopening, we will post the quilt exhibition dates. But we very much, after all that work, want to get that on view when we're able to view in public. So it looks like we have quite a few people, and we'll get going. So for everyone who's just logged on, welcome again to the Newark Museum of Art virtually. My name is Amy Simon Hopwood. I'm the Associate Curator of Decorative Arts. And with me today is Luke Haynes, a quilting architect who works at the colliding the function of craft and the context of art into a body of textile art. He has training in art and architecture, and then became interested in quilting. I will let Luke talk more about that, but he has a whole kind of personal story, but both building on architectural training, art training, and the quilting experience. He really blurs these ideas of history and contemporary design, architecture, and as you'll see, some wonderful imageries. Has work in the collections across the US, including the Newark Museum of Art. And he's now located in Kansas City, but has lived and worked around the country. And let me just mention, I mentioned that Ulysses Grant Dietz acquired one of his quilts. And so now I'm very excited to welcome Luke back to the museum virtually. And so here we all are to hear more about your work, Luke. So welcome, and we can put up the presentation.
Yeah, I really appreciate it. This is a lot of fun. I'm looking forward to the opening of that show at the museum. And I hope to be there in person whenever that happens as well. So I'm glad
Yes, I'll keep everyone posted.
give a presentation now to chat a little bit about myself, and hopefully everyone watching will come see the show when that happens too. So I guess I'll just jump right into it and just give you guys kind of overview of myself and my work, and kind of give you some ideas of my arc as a career and as a thinker and a maker. So the first slide. So here I am 3 years ago in Los Angeles, about to move my way across the country to Kansas City. But you can kind of see a little bit of the arc of my work. So I come from architecture, and what that means is I think about things in a engagement way, kind of like a designer, in that architects think about spatial awareness and material engagement. So creating environment, creating function and utility becomes really important to the kind of arc of understanding the work. Next slide. So here is a piece that you can kind of see there is actually was displayed in the Newark Museum, and right there over on the right hand side, you can see me kind of being very excited to work with the museum, which has been such an honor over the years. And here's a bigger picture of it on the left. And what you can see is I've taken postures from art. So what you can see is kind of this reference to Grant Wood's American Gothic, and that's about kind of capturing the zeitgeist of understanding what we as a culture understand to be high art. That is painting, that is these oil paintings. There's a very small brackets for what is understood to be high art, quote unquote. And so for me as a quilter, I come up against that brick wall so often. People kind of say, oh, you're a crafter, and then dismiss me from a concept standpoint. And so making this body of work, this was a show that I made, taking postures from American art. I'm referencing that it is my intention to make art, because I'm taking a posture that people understand from an existing painting. And so what I want to do is say, I am making an art object. And I'm fine if people disagree. You can say, oh, it's just a blanket, who cares? But the intention is that people see the object and say, well, he's trying to make art. And if they say he's trying to make art and I disagree, that's a conversation I'm fine to have, as long as I'm not dismissed, as long as other people who use craft medium aren't dismissed because of a bias towards the medium. And the people here are life-sized, and the bed you can see there, you can see kind of it's a blanket, it's a quilt that's bed size. So it's this really important reference to the history of the object, as well as the history of making. The background is all used clothing as well. Next slide. So here is a picture of me when I had a residency on Governor's Island, outside of New York City. Gosh, I guess about 8 years ago, trying to look really cool in front of my quilt. So in this one, I wanted to put up because it's an interesting process to talk about both iconography and quilting. So this one is Jay-Z and Kanye West overlapped. And so it's these two very iconic musicians. And I've made the quilt out of sheets, jeans, and dress clothes. It's called Rags to Riches because it's this arc of career for these two individuals, but also the material itself. So the sheets obviously are about privacy, the kind of home, hidden safety, and the jeans are kind of your everyday. And then through dress clothes are these kind of things you wear when you're important, when you need to go out, when you are very public facing. So the material really matches the subject matter as well. So I think that's really important. And one of the really wonderful things about quilt making is that I get the opportunity of working with a material that has an existing story to it. So the story of the material can reference the story of the subject, can reference the story of the object, and really have this entire arc of conversation. Next slide. Here is, that's me on the bed. So this is a series called On My Bed. obviously. You can see why, because it's on the bed, and it's a tongue-in-cheek reference to the artist implicit in his work conversation. So the idea being that I'm very present with the fact that I make functional items, functional objects. That's an active intention of mine coming from architecture. And so I make a bed-sized self-portrait every year, and I use it on the bed so that it becomes kind of this velveteen rabbit. The quilt is a real quilt by the nature of use. Um, and it also changes as I change. This one was from a while ago, so you can kind of see some of the change in my skill sets, some of the change in both my physical body as well. I've changed over time, so each quilt represents a change in myself, as well as a skill set, as well as sort of work and what I'm interested in terms of fabric, but also just kind of a way to answer the question about, are these functional items and is that important? And so you can see pretty clearly that yes and yes. Next slide, please. This is a quilt that was at launch in Chelsea, made out of a flag. The flag itself I bought was 20 feet by 30 feet. And I bought it from Goodwill for $1.99 because they considered it a linen. And I was able to take the flag, which had been used quite extensively. You can see in there some of the modeling of the fabric that happened over the years of it being flown. It's a specific kind of flag. It's called a garrison flag, which is just about the scale of it, which means that it flew at some kind of a Army base, Navy base, something like that, something government. So it was an important flag. And then it was somehow made its way through the system to Goodwill. There's really particular systems of discarding used flags, and somehow that didn't happen to this one, which lucky for me, I was able to get a hold of it and then deconstruct it and reconstruct it back into a flag to honor the history of the material and the history of the iconography implicit to the subject matter of the flag. So I cut it apart and made it back into a flag, but I quilted it. And so you can see the stars are all broken apart and then sewn back together. So it's this kind of really beautiful conversation of the material and the use and the history and the kind of modeling of the fabric. So it becomes a more kind of tangible object as opposed to just the iconography and the idea of flag. This one becomes a very clear object. It's heavy, it's quilted, there's 3 layers, there's batting, you could sleep under it. It's in the collection of the International Quilt Study Center Museum in Lincoln, Nebraska, which is a great honor. And if anyone's ever near, please go take a look. They always have wonderful, wonderful objects. Next slide, please. So this is a series that I made trying to talk about a question. And so a lot of the works that I make come in series, coming on the tail, the heels of other questions that arose from the last series. So this one right here is part of a series that I made because the question goes like this: why are you putting pictures on quilts? Why is it important that you're sewing a figure on a quilt? Because I could easily print it out, right? Like photography, at this point, the scale can be infinite, right? You can print a billboard scaled photo, so it's not about making something bigger. It's so, and I've got a lot of things to say about it. So this series right here is a response to that question that I asked myself, like, why am I working with portraits and quilts? What's important about the quilt object that people can come into a gallery, into a museum, into a collection, into a home, and see this object and what makes it important as an object? So I asked friends of mine to sit for portraits. And then I asked them to leave me the clothes they were wearing when they sat for the portrait. Then I made a quilt portrait of them out of their own clothes. So what happens is the actual object that you're coming into contact with is made of their own clothes. So the physical fabric they use to represent themselves becomes my tools to represent them in a portrait. So it becomes this soul of the person through their fabric in a way. So that makes the object more important. So instead of just printing out an image or using some paint or charcoal to reference something, the object becomes really important. It's actually made from the clothing the person was wearing. And the background is made out of reclaimed clothing from where that person lives. So it's this reference of environment to specific individual, and also the reference of the story of all of the garments that came together for the background, and then the specific garments that the individual was made out of. And so you can see kind of here the reference between the two. The colors that I had to work with were different for every individual and pretty finite. So the ability to make a portrait was limited and interesting, and the scale of the person changed depending on how much or how little clothing they wore. And this is just one example from that series. Next. So after working with the ideas of understanding quilts as important objects, I wanted to help prove that through the object itself. So as an architect, you think about creating a space that answers questions without having to give someone a booklet. So if you don't walk into someone's house and have to read a novel on how to use the bathroom or where the kitchen is or which side the floor is. And so I wanted to bring into the quilts that I make some of that implicit understanding of the conversation I'm trying to have. So what you're looking at here is a quilt that's designed to be anamorphic perspective. So this is an age-old technique, 1500s. There's the ambassadors, which has this long extended skull. So it's not a new thing, but what I've done in putting it in quilts is asking people to move around the quilt to understand it. So you see the quilt from the front and you get the understanding of the material, the structure, the method, composition, some of my quilting techniques, but you have to view it from a very particular angle to see the figure on it appropriately. And what that does is actually force a viewer to move around it and sort of prove the object in the fourth dimension in order to kind of understand that quilts are sculptural objects and hold a space in a really nice, interesting, and historically important way. And kind of talking about quilts as sculpture has become my soapbox, as it were, for the last couple of years, because I think it's important to understand that quilts and crafts and function and utility objects can be brilliant and beautiful and conceptual as well. So I want to kind of knock everyone over the head with that using the objects I make. Next slide, please. So this is a series I made understanding the same thing, kind of talking about quilts as sculpture, as well as a design challenge. So I gave myself a challenge to use a single quilt block, the log cabin block, and make 50 different quilts using just that block. And what you can see in this image is that I was able to make a wide variety of quilt patterns and textures with it. And then I was using some of the concepts from minimalist art in the 70s. So the original working title of this show was The Log Cabins of Donald Judd, because Donald Judd's work is all about materials and space. And then I took some of these spirals, some of these Richard Serra kind of understandings of engaging and interacting with space in another kind of environment to kind of reference people who've come before me, but also to kind of create an architecture out of individual sculptural items. Next slide, please. And excuse me. So after working with these objects, after working with understanding, pushing, questioning what it is to make sculpture. And so sculpture for me is anything that you have to understand in the fourth dimension. And what that means is moving around it. Or for example, in jewelry, it has to be worn. So you watch it go by, you see light strike it, you see some shimmers. I mean, if you're talking about large scale marble sculpture, in order to understand the Michelangelo's David, you have to sort of navigate around it. And you have to understand the scale was designed so that the top was bigger, so that as you're looking from below, you're amazed by the scale, but it also accounts for the eye. So anyway, the idea of moving around an object to understand its sculpturalness became really important. And I've been trying to work on books and trying to work on images, trying to work on ways of explaining sculpture through pictures, because the vast majority of people will only ever see my work or most people's work in pictures through books, online, Instagram. And so trying to convey the idea of sculpture through two-dimensional media has become kind of a difficult challenge for myself. So how do I say I've made something that holds space by taking a flat picture of it? And so I've worked with a lot of photographers all over the world trying to kind of understand how to convey that fourth dimension in a still image. And it becomes really interesting and difficult with quilts, because what happens is quilts have a narrative to them of use and function. So I first started putting quilts in just environments, and people would comment or call me and say, why is that quilt laying there? Why is there a quilt on the floor? Did somebody drop it? You know, whose Nana was there and, you know, forgot their picnic attire? So it just becomes this really interesting conversation of narrative implicit to object. Again, kind of pulling back from architecture and design. And so I've worked with a lot of photographers and trying to convey this sculptural connotation to these domestic objects. Is there one more slide?
Yeah.
Next. So here's the last little bit that I'll talk about for now before we get into questions. This is a series I've made, I'm working on for a show that's going to tour around Japan. And so these are bed-sized quilts. They're 90 inches by 90 inches. The background is used sheets. In the foreground are these images of balloon animals, obviously. I worked with a balloon animal maker here in Kansas City to create the images, and then had the fabric made to go on top of the quilts. And so this one is about conversation of value implicit to work, because it's obviously, I mean, anyone who does a balloon animal is referencing Jeff Koons, right? I mean, he put his big old stamp on it. Any museum of any merit, any lobby who's important has to have a Jeff Koons, and you have $35 million to buy a paperweight. And I like the objects. I'm certainly not trying to be diminutive of the objects. They're interesting. They reference things. Everyone has opinions about them, good, bad, or whatever. But I really want to reference the value of the objects, because quilts are so undervalued fiscally, right? They're, oh, 20 bucks. Oh, my grandma makes those. Oh, I'd love to buy one. Here's a small amount of money, not realizing that the materials themselves cost hundreds of dollars. There's tens to thousands of hours, depending on who makes what, how their material is put together, etc. So by referencing these high dollar art objects, I'm bringing back this conversation of kind of art to craft, and what does that mean? And, you know, I'm making sculpture too. So I'm referencing these other sculptures in a sculpture, but it's a quilt. So having that kind of bias brought to these objects kind of begs the question, what's the value of these? Can they also be valuable art sculpture versus just kind of blankets and throwaway picnic items? So there's kind of 10 ideas that I work with, and I think now is time for questions.
Right. So, well, I just keep thinking and so many different things, but we have a few questions, so I'll keep mine for if we run out, which I doubt it. So the first question that came up, kind of absorbing all of everything you've said, is, was there an underground of men quilting when you started? Was there a community of male quilters, since it's such a female activity?
Sure. I mean, there certainly have, I mean, there's always been male quilters, and a lot of the male quilters come from tailoring. I mean, if you look way kind of far back, there's male quilters who were tailors who on their spare time had this beautiful fabric and they put it together. Mm-hmm. Quilting, however, is a very important female medium. It was historically really, really important to women because it was one of the very first American jobs where women could make money. So where women could congregate. There was from a perspective of historical importance, women in quilting really are hand in hand. And I think that's really important to talk about. You know, I think it's important to sort of reference the fact that quilting allowed a platform for women to make their own money and to have a community in a time when women were very disenfranchised.
Right,
So
right.
just to say that, really important. When I was starting to quilt, there were some men who quilted, but the vast majority of people who make quilts were women, coming from sort of domesticity, but also this history of pedagogy, sort of dropped, you know, grandmother, mother, daughter, grandchild, this kind of a thing. Because of that historical importance of the female in the material, but also the domestic sort of understanding that women were the people kind of making these objects. But yeah, there were men who made quilts, and there still are, probably more so now that we're kind of seeing a difference of gender expectation.
Right, right, right. So, and it's kind of, and it ties in again with this like art versus craft, and they're much more, those boundaries are also blurred.
Yeah.
Wonderful. Oh, so I can go on for hours on that, but we have more questions. So what first drew you to quilting as an artistic medium, and who or what would you say your main artistic influences are?
Oh boy, well, so what drew me first to quilting, I was in art school and then in architecture school, and was working on quilts on the side, but actually it goes back much further. I started knitting in the 8th grade. This is sort of prior to all of our good acronyms we have now, ADD, ADHD, like basically kids who aren't paying attention. So I was fortunate enough to go to school that allowed me to knit in the back of English class. And my little hands had something to do. I could pay attention to Huckleberry Finn or whatever the crap we were learning.
Right, right, right. But it is.
So I knitted forever, and it's just this idea of making something, making a tangible item out of my time, right? So then I went to art school. You draw a lot of charcoal drawings. You make a lot of crappy paintings. I went to architecture school. I make a lot of things. And I had some fabric, and I thought, gosh, can I make a picture using this fabric? And I used the fabric, made a picture, wasn't brilliant, but I had a quilt to show for it. And so I have this pile of charcoal drawings that weren't great and a quilt that wasn't great. But at the end of the day, this one I could still use. And that really sort of sparked this idea of, gosh, function implicit in my practice of making art really was interesting. Inspiration, I mean, across the board, name a medium and there's, you know, inspiration there. I mean, my favorite quilter, because he's a brilliant friend of mine, is Joe Cunningham. He's my mentor, good friend, a peer of mine. We do a lot of collaborations. Brilliant, brilliant work. Architects, I mean, we've got Tadeo Ando, Shigeru Ban, a lot of Japanese architects, because they really focus on the craft of material making, and I find that to be really beautiful. There's this kind of reference to the method of making in the object of the architecture, and I find that to be very quilterly. Painting, Chuck Close, just because of his arc of understanding how mark making is important through a series of media, through a series of trials in his own life. And again, I could go on there, but there's a couple.
Oh, wonderful. Well, I have another question that kind of ties in with thinking of you learning to knit. How did you learn the sewing and quilting skills?
Well, the glib answer is I faked it, you know, fake it till you make it, right? I mean, so I just kind of, I had a sewing machine that my dad's ex-girlfriend's mother gave me, that I kind of toted around and sewed things together until it fit, right? But that's the glib answer. The real answer is, of course, nobody lives in a vacuum, right? So I was trying it myself in my studio while paying attention to what other people were making, going into the sewing shops, asking a lot of questions. So, you know, the short answer is self-taught. The long answer is I'm a part of a global community of makers who put their work out there that I can look at.
Right, wonderful. And it's thinking of all of your different trainings all merging together. So let's see, I have another question. Hello, I recently heard John Preuss, I don't know if Price, Preus, describe his art objects as a way to practice relationships. Do you hope or intend for people to learn anything about interacting or developing relationships with each other through interacting with your art? And I think you did start when you were talking about the materiality.
I mean, that's a really interesting way to reference one's art practice. I mean, it certainly makes a lot of sense depending on the medium one uses. You're spending a lot of time with something, right, that you kind of then put out into the world. Most of my works are about engaging with an idea, a concept, an object, not so much yet necessarily about kind of multiplicity, engaging a community through an object. It's more idea, one-on-one reference, certainly conversations with me through the object,
Right.
not necessarily multiple humans engaging through the understanding of an object, except if you're in the same space with it, obviously.
Right, right. And then also that's the beauty of when people see art or objects in someone's home, in a gallery, in a museum, then the viewer brings all of their personal associations, which may or connect to what you were thinking, but also brings a whole new perspective.
Sure, sure. I mean, the quilts are historically private.
Right.
I mean, they're for the bed, right? Which is a private place. I mean, there's a long story about how quilts actually became popular because they were proving the wealth of a family. So they weren't actually about being private. They were about showing off the value of the fabric you could buy and the amount of free time you had for doing all of the hand stitching. So
Right.
the sort of privacy, not privacy is a contested issue, but now we understand quilts to be a private bed thing. So making a private thing public doesn't always create a lot of conversation, just because you're sort of referencing your most vulnerable sleep.
Right. It's very, very personal. And now I have another fabric question. I know you mentioned a little bit about the balloon images, but someone would love to hear a bit more about the fabric. And you mentioned that you'd worked with a source in Japan.
So I mean, my fabric is across the board. I'll buy fabric, I'll source fabric, I'll find fabric. The particular balloon animal series was all sheets for the backgrounds, these kind of very bright, floral 70s, 80s sheets that I've been collecting for a long time to create kind of this background of very vibrant kind of shapes. And then putting the balloon animal on top of it. I worked with a company to actually print the balloon animals. So it's this kind of brand new on top of this old, sort of these private, these used, these sheets, these references to a bygone aesthetic era behind closed doors, and then these brand new printed, playful images that go on top of them. So this kind of conversation about the object of quilts and then the understanding of art. And so that reference between the two of them.
Okay, great. And it's like there's so many layers literally in a quilt, and then layers of meaning in the fabric. And I have, just reading them in order, please tell us about the celebrity number 4, Obama. I am especially interested in the very broad shoulders. So you mentioned a little bit about that perspective.
Sure. So the images I think will be available again on Facebook, but if you can find them on my website. But so if you're looking at the quilt head on, it looks really skewed, and your eyes kind of are trying to understand why he's so broad, what's wrong with the physical dimensions. But the image I shared, you can see that the second image is from the appropriate perspective. So he actually looks exactly right. He looks to his correct dimensions. And the quilt itself is his actual height. So he should look exactly life size in real life. And so this kind of conversation about his body existing in a three-dimensional space, but it's about walking around the quilt, because if you see it at front, he looks very wide. So you're exactly right. His shoulders are very wide. But if you look at it from the appropriate angle, he looks exactly right. So his shoulders should be true to dimension.
So really that the motion around, again, this
Right.
idea of space.
Understanding quilts in a three-dimensional space. It actually, you have to see it from an angle in order to understand the image.
Right. Okay, that's great. And it makes me think of on your bed as well, of you lying on your bed. Here I have a Facebook question. Someone wants to know, how long does it take you to make one of your quilts? And are they all about the same time, or is there a
Oh no, there
range?
is such a range in, I mean, some of them are weeks, some of them are years. I employ help sometimes. I mean, you know, I get studio assistants to come help me produce shows, and so you know that vastly changes the time it takes to make an object. It depends on my skill set as I'm developing a new pattern, say, or a new methodology. That can take a really long time of trials, errors,
Mhm.
some small samples to understand how it works, and then you know possibly just kind of ruining the object and having to start over. So depends on how you consider that built in. So you
Right,
know
the
the
time.
last quilt I made took me 37 years.
Right. So it's always a process. And Roderick says hello and also says, I like the backs of your quilts. Can you speak to these, to the
Oh, he
backside,
would.
the
He
reverse?
would. He 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 loves a quilt backside, and you know I love that about him. So I love that you asked that, Roderick. So quilts as sculpture, and again, that's my soapbox, so I'm gonna harp on it again. What does that mean that it's sculpture? That means it holds space, that you have to understand it in kind of this fourth dimension. But quilts specifically being sculpture means there's a back to them. You know, it's not just a painting that has a back to hold those pigments on the wall. Quilts actually have another side. And I wasn't able to put any slides of those because of, you know, only 10, but the backs of quilts for me are really important.
Mhm.
And what you're allowed with the back of a quilt is to have kind of a look under the hood, right? I mean, if you're thinking about a car, you think, okay, this shiny whatever Ferrari, it's beautiful, it's red, it's sleek. But the other conversation that anyone has about a Ferrari is, how fast does it go? How many cylinders does it have? Look under the engine, look under the hood. And I think quilts are similar in that the front is about this piecing, this technique, this kind of showing of what you want to present. But the back talks about how it's put together. Is it hand quilted? Is it machine quilted? Is it heavily quilted? What material do you use for the back? And the backs of mine are almost exclusively sheets. And so
Mhm.
there's this conversation of discarded fabric that come together to create the kind of background that I think are just as interesting as the front. It becomes this kind of vestige reference to the front through the quilting technique, and a way to understand the maker's intention.
Right, right. Okay, and this kind of builds on it, and you may have already explained it just now, but I want to honor the question. So, why do you refer to sculpture as fourth dimension rather than 3D? Like, what distinction between the three dimension?
Sure. I mean, so interesting question. So sculpture is in the third dimension. Like that's absolutely true, right? It exists in three dimensions, but in order to understand it, you have to have the fourth dimensions. As a viewer, we aren't able to triangulate. We
Mhm.
have two eyes, right? So we're able to have a depth, but
Right,
not a spatial awareness. So
right,
without having a sort of third ocular input, we can only understand things in the two dimensions. So for us as finite human biological creatures, we have to move to get that third dimension of volume. So
oh,
I
okay,
reference that fourth dimension because we have to move in order to see anything more than a flat plane.
right, right,
So
okay.
they exist in the third dimension, but in order to understand that for us as creatures with our, you know, biology, we have to move. So to prove the third dimension, you have to understand it in the fourth.
Right. Oh, okay. Well, thank you. That's really helpful for me as well. And here, again, you had mentioned a lot of reclaimed and recycled fabric, and the balloons were some newer fabrics. But someone wants to know even more. Do you ever purchase fabric, or is recycled fabric essential to your process?
And again, my arc of fabric is across the board. Right now, I'm working on a series with kimonos that I bought last time I was in Japan. So that's, you know, those textiles are referencing the environment I bought them from. So I'm working with an 80-year-old Sashiko artist there. So we're kind of doing this beautiful collaboration. So the conversation there very much is about the material.
Right.
And the same with the balloon animals, the conversation is about the material. So it really depends on what I'm making. I
Right.
absolutely buy fabric. The vast majority is sourced used because then the material has a story to it.
Right.
Has a history. People can come up and say, oh, I had that shirt. I had those sheets. My kids had those sheets. Are those Pound Puppies? Is that Harry Potter? Is there a, you get, and then it kind of rolls from there, especially because I think quilts have a beautiful quality that they're accessible to people who aren't necessarily self-proclaimed art understanders. I don't know how to say that grammatically correctly, but people don't always give themselves permission to look at art.
Right.
Because they think there's a barrier of knowledge.
Right.
Quilts don't have that. People
No.
and say, oh, it's a blanket, it's a quilt, well, what's it made out of?
Right.
And if I can give that to people by having it made out of something they understand, so much the better. How brilliant to have an entry point in the microcosm as opposed to just image.
Right. And so, yeah, it just draws people in literally. And so here's someone also was interested in your use of fabrics and also wanted to know, do you still knit? And if so, do you design or have favorite knit influencers?
I haven't knit in a long time, for better or worse, who knows why. About every couple of years, I'll pick it up and, knit something, see if I still remember how.
Right.
Gosh, I don't know much about contemporary knitting as far as who's a maker or designer. I've got my stash of sock books that I bought in the late 90s that I still use. And otherwise I'll kind of, fake it myself.
Right. And it looks like we have time for just a couple more questions. And so my apologies to those of you who I didn't get to. Let's see. So there's art, there are crafts, there's architecture, even photography and more. Thinking of architecture isn't an art. Then once the design is artfully completed, are the makers who constructed the building, the bridge, are they the craftspeople? So again, kind of, I think the questioner is getting at this idea of who's the artist and what are those boundaries for you?
It's a brilliant question because in the craft world, you get a lot of backlash for hiring help. I have been blacklisted from events because I've hired people to help me make objects.
Right.
Whereas nobody expects an architect to bring a hammer.
Right.
And there's a whole, there's a gambit, and there's the gambit that makes it there. It's important on both ends, right? I mean, in the art world, sometimes it's really important that the artist was the person who painted it. And other times it's just Damien Hirst and it doesn't matter, right? So it's the eye of the beholder as to what's important. So it's down to every individual. I am a person who believes that my work wouldn't have been made without me. So hiring people to do some of the technical skill to create it, it's still my object.
Right.
And there's some brilliant versus sometimes I do collaborations, and that is when somebody brings a skill set that I don't have to the table, or they add their own understanding and makes the object better than I would have on my own. So there's a gray area there, and I definitely call those collaborations versus hiring people. And again, architects aren't expected to use a hammer, but craftspeople are expected to do everything themselves. And my answer to that sometimes when people get really full of vitriol about it is, who grew the cotton, right? I mean, who smelted the metal to make the needle? And, if somebody expects me to have done every part of the process, but they think it's okay for me to buy fabric, then at what point are they understanding where their value lies? They're just kind of frustrated about then I'm not doing the thing that they do in their projects. And that's also valid. Again, it's important to each person individually, and I'm not expecting anyone to change their opinion, but just be aware that I'm doing it very intentionally. I want to make 50 quilts a year sometimes, and I cannot physically do that by myself.
Right. So it's the process has limitations, but it's really, I think to sum up, it's the artist, the maker, what do they bring to it?
Right, right. And is that important enough to the viewer, right? If somebody is buying an object because it was masterfully made exclusively, then it's really important about the making. If you're buying an object exclusively because of the concept, well, then it doesn't matter as much. Is it a banana taped to the wall, or is it a intricately carved 15th century Ming room divider, right? I mean, so in that case, it's about the maker, you know, et cetera, et cetera. So that conversation is deep and fraught and
Right, right. Well, I know I have a few more questions. I'm going to end with one last one that kind of ties into kind of all of the ideas that you're thinking about, and then thinking of all of you viewers right now in your homes. Some people are really taking on more crafts in this coronavirus situation. So I have one last person saying, I like most people tend to associate quilts with comfort and safety, ideas that have taken on added significance at this particular moment. How do you see these concepts playing into your designs? Are you working consciously to subvert them, integrate them? And do you see the current crisis as having an impact on your work?
oh boy, yeah. I mean, so the current crisis will have an impact. It just hasn't hit yet because I've got so many things I'm trying to finish, you know, because quilts takes forever. You know, I've got books full of ideas from a decade ago that I haven't even started. Ultimately, it will, but I'm not finished with the shows I'm working on right now to get to that point. I'm certainly not trying to subvert that, right? I think it's important. You know, I haven't made any quilts with razor blades in them, which would be a conversation. I think that the items themselves have implicit comfort, and I think that's important in talking about them as soft sculpture. But I'm not necessarily pushing or diminishing that. I think it's there for an entry point into the object.
Mm-hmm. Wonderful. Okay, well, I have my head's buzzing with all of these ideas. I would love to personally talk with you, and I'm sure all of our viewers would too. So my mind is spinning. Thank you. I think that's like the ultimate compliment, that both your words and your work really are generating these thoughts. I have one person made a comment that you have inspired her to pull out her latest dormant quilt project from hibernation and get back to work on it. So it's so wonderful to get to know you here, and for all of our viewers to hear you and ask questions and really think about these questions, and just generally thank you for this inspiration.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it. It was an honor to work with you guys. Yeah.
Wonderful. And I look forward to the day that we can meet in person and look at your quilts together. And before we go, everyone, thank you for your questions and your interest. And I just want to mention next week's Lunch and Learn is the same time, same bat channel. Next Thursday, the 21st at noon. And as always, you can register on the museum's at-home website or on Facebook Live. It will be a local Newark artist, Joelle Lopez, will be speaking with some of our curatorial departments. So thank you, everyone. And most of all, thank you so much, Luke. This has been really wonderful. Wonderful. Take care, everyone.